Today we are working on an interior page for Lady Mechanika. Oh, before I forget, good morning, well, good afternoon. This is like my second cup of coffee already. So without further ado, let's get started. So right now I am prepping the small layout to print on 11 by 17 print paper so that I could lightbox it for the final pencils onto a Bristol board that I use. Generally speaking, Bristol board is what most comic books are drawn on, and it's usually 11 by 17. Well, here we go. Ready to lightbox. Usually when I start tracing the layouts, I don't actually want it to look exactly because I'm pretty rough with the layout, so it's not how the pencils are going to look necessarily. I just have to make sure the placement of everything is where I want it to be. So it's fairly rough. And that's why I'm also using the just a regular regular wooden pencil. Although I could argue that wooden pencils are actually ideal for some situations where you gotta move really fast. I don't usually do tight pencils on any of my pages, at least not recently, since I'm also the inker on the projects. And by tight pencils, I mean there is very little sketch marks, and when you're light tabling the pages, a lot of times artists would tighten their pencils, and that's why they use a light table to begin with. But I like to have my pencils kind of loose, that way when I go in there and ink it, you know, there's like a certain level of spontaneity with it. There are certain aspects and elements of the page that I don't mind having, you know, spontaneous and more loose. But when it comes to things like the face or objects that require a lot of detail and precision, I tighten those up more. That way I get almost exactly what I want in the penciling phase and then the inking phase. Whereas things like hair and maybe fabric, just extra lines and, you know, adding texture, that doesn't need to be super tight, and I don't ink it as such. And so I like to tighten my faces, generally speaking, and everything else is kind of loose. I think the biggest challenge and question that most people have is kind of, well, where do you start, you know, when you're drawing a page? I mean, I don't know how other artists do it. Some people probably go from first panel all the way down to the last panel in order. I like to skip around, especially if I start my day and, you know, I'm having a hard time kind of getting things going. I just start where I think I will get the most momentum, because the first 15 minutes or so are the hardest when you're starting on something. So I just try to get momentum first, and then after doing it for an hour, it kind of flows. And you know, with my schedule nowadays, I don't always get to sit at my desk and draw 8 hours straight. I'm always doing some of the other stuff. So getting the momentum going is obviously the most important thing for projects like this, especially if you're doing interior pages where it is very long and drawn out. You got to find momentum and inspiration wherever you can. I am eyedropping my Kuretake Manga ink onto the porcelain palette because I don't want to use too much of the ink, and then I don't want it to I don't want the bottle to close and, you know, not open, because when the ink crusts, it's really hard to open it sometimes. So this is like my workaround. Again, when I start inking, I also kind of ink where I feel like I could get the most momentum, and if there's something I'm excited to ink, I usually start with that. Luckily for me, this page has plenty of elements that I would love to just start on, so I just kind of, wherever my eyes take me right away, I just start there, then get the momentum going, and you know, kind of fill the page out. And sometimes it's also good to start on a certain part of the panel where if I loaded the brush too much and there's too much ink, then I could cover it up, or it would be easy just to ink over that spot instead of like maybe a face or something where if I mess up, I'd end up using my paint marker to clean off the lines that I don't want. So I think it's always good to start where you feel most comfortable and where you're excited. This is considered a talking head page where there's very little backgrounds and it's just a conversation between two characters. So, you know, I don't have to be too concerned with switching up my brush or, you know, having to complete that section of it, because usually with backgrounds and stuff like that, I switch to a pen if I had to, or I'm more thoughtful about the layout of the page. So the ink is very new, and I would have to blot it just to get it so it's not so runny. Because some of these lines I want it to be very, very fine. And you know, blotting is the only way to get it to be more, I guess, dry and fine instead of as thick as it is right now. And I do skip around from panel to panel. You know, probably not spend too much time on the small details and then focus more on the broader shapes before I start adding detail, because that's when you have tight deadlines, and if you spend too much time on small details at first, you're not going to have any energy to finish the rest of the page. Mind you, this took me a long time to kind of figure out what my speed was and where I'm focusing all my attention. So this is from tough experiences, to say the least, if you're trying to get deadlines done. I skip, oopsies. Okie-dokie. Okay, how are we doing now? Cool. So I skip around when I'm inking, and I try to ink the outlines first and the bigger objects first, so that, like I said earlier, so that I get pages done on time and my eyes will basically focus on the bigger shapes instead of you know, being too focused on the details. And with Lady Mechanika, I don't want to mess up any of the faces at all. Trying to be very thoughtful, so I'll probably do the faces last, just so I don't get into any trouble with you know, trying to rush it, or the ink like on the brush is it's too loaded, so it's better to be careful. And sure, you know, I mean, it's not always perfect, but I've gotten pretty used to knowing when not to ink the faces. But here's the thing, I still mess up, and in those cases I just use the gel pens or the marker pens, the white ones, just to correct my lines, even though I'd rather not do that, because it just looks like you've gone over it with something, and especially if someone ends up buying the page, then it's going to be noticeable. Okay, that's okay. So that's what I mean. Like, I'm probably going to leave it right here and go on to the next panel. There you go. So there's definitely an advantage to having the ink outside of the well, or outside of the bottle jar, because then I can allow it to thicken and dry a little bit more, and I'll get the fine lines that I want. Because right now, the lines are, or the strokes are starting to look thinner, like how I prefer it. So this is what I had in mind, or a good, decent amount. Inking hair is actually one of my favorite things to do. When I'm actually penciling the hair, I only pencil in like the guidelines and the direction that I want the hair to go. So it's basically in big chunks, and then when I go in there with my brush, I actually, add all the little strands and the detail and stuff like that, afterwards. And that way it just, because if I spent all that time inking hair, it might take forever, and it might also look kind of methodical, where I just want it to be a little fluid and free flowing, like I think hair should be. So I choose to go with the more chunkier route, almost like anime hairstyle, and then kind of go in there with detail later. Now right here, it's really easy to go in there and, like, because I was just doing hair not that long ago, to go in there and detail the hair. But I have to remind myself that I have to focus on the larger shapes, go in there and outline that and get that going, and then go in there and do the finer details and the shadows. If I were to do it perfectly, it would go outlines, shadows, and then details, and then faces last, because oh my gosh, if I mess up on a face, I would hate to have to use my paint markers all the time, and then it'd just be paint markers everywhere. Okay, we are going to ink her glasses with the brush. I know it sounds crazy and I might regret it, but I'm gonna go for it. I made sure that the ink on the brush is already somewhat dry, or it's drier, so it's a little thicker. I can make a finer line. I was gonna pull out my circle template, but then I realized it might look too perfect, or the outline might be a little too, the stroke would be one size basically. So if I did it this way, it would be more varying line weight. Like I said before, if it doesn't work out, I could always use the paint marker to correct it. But this is the kind of stuff I do because no, I shouldn't say this, but I'm too lazy to practice half the time on a sheet of paper when I'm in the middle of a deadline. And I don't try a lot of crazy new things when I'm doing, when I have deadlines like this, but then, I learned. And it's not the first time I've done circles and ellipses with the brush, so it's not as scary as it seems. What's nice about the paper, the brush, and especially the ink that I use is I'm able to go pretty fast because it seeps into the paper, and that's why I don't really use nibs, is because I have to wait for the ink to dry on the surface of the paper. And that's what the smudge guard is for, so that I don't end up having to regret going so quickly. It snowed today, and that kind of helped revive my excitement for being at my workstation. And there's times when, even where I'm situated right now, it's really tough to get going work-wise, because it's always what's kind of in your head that's kind of keeping you from seeing what's in front of you. So there's always that revival and that need for inspiration. And I think that instead of thinking this was going to isolate me and get me to focus more, it adds all these other challenges. So I try to revert back to when I was, living in a little apartment in Seattle or in downtown, where it was always surrounded by stuff. There was all this just I wouldn't call it distractions, but there was just constantly stimulation coming from all sorts of directions. And I was able to focus. So, I'm trying to figure out now where my focus point is every day and what gets me going no matter what the situation is. And, eventually I get to that point where I'm able to create and draw. And maybe it's like working out, where you got to get your muscles warmed up, you got to get your brain warmed up, and it's that whole routine and process of just drawing and creating all the time. It's like any other job. You kind of have to be on point every day that you're working on something. In conclusion, I think drawing comic books is a very daunting and challenging task. And, after kind of going through the process myself, I realize all the different things that you end up having to learn to do and then to create. But, I think that's why I do it. It's for the challenge and for the experience of conquering something that was otherwise hard or seemed impossible. Hopefully this inspires you to keep pushing to better your art and to enjoy every little aspect of creating a piece of art, because it's magical and rewarding. All that said, thanks for joining me again, and I hope to see you guys around.